We'll do it live. Welcome to the DIY thrown together edition of Presbycast. The Chortles Weekly is stuck in a hotel room in an undisclosed location remix edition. Hence, if you are watching live right now, we don't have our standard caliber of intro music. Or as the first words ever said on Presbycast were, well, we said there'd always be bumper music.
No, the words were, well, imagine bumper music.
Okay. Well, either way,
who could have imagined what it would become?
I'm just really glad that I can do my impression of you in front of you. But Presbyterian here, Chortles Weekly, along with our two esteemed colleagues, guests, internet typography artists, as we're here to talk about Twitter, which kind of friggin' rules, because it's probably about 60% of the reason this show was even started anyways. And I think if our house was circular, this would be in it. It would be directly in our wheelhouse. This is the kind of thing that we love to talk about. For those of you who are hoping for the next 5 rounds of some sort of motion picture snake draft, you may have to wait. Many topics are being thrown at us. Additional ones are probably henceforth coming, either from the same, I can't really say cast of characters. I think that's a Escondido unnamed podcast term. But, we'll see. Maybe we'll do Limp Bizkit songs or something like that. Who knows? But Chortles, introduce our guests. Let's get talking. I am shocked and surprised at our topics here tonight.
Well, I think I'm going to refer to these guys as our Southern Gentlemen panel. We've got 2 guys who are friends of ours and friends of each other. Don't know if we put them together. Probably not. Miles Smith IV, a newly minted public intellectual, and Ben Glazer, our favorite small-town pastor. So how are you gentlemen tonight?
Doing great, thanks.
Fantastic.
All right, well, we're all in a happy place. Well, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, the world epicenter of gentrification and high prices.
It is the Mid-Atlantic's Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's something. I lived here 30 years ago, and I was a fish out of water then, and much more so now. There's no doubt. So I'm here in Raleigh for the NAPARC. Am I doing something with my hands? See,
No. calling it the Mid-Atlantic Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
Got away with me.
I thought I did something with my hand symbols.
You are making that okay sign.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is a different angle, working from the laptop. I'm at the annual meeting of NAPARC as a delegate for the PCA. So we've had 2.5 full days of Presbyterian fun and also Reformed. Lots of Dutch guys here, lots of Canadians, and it's been interesting. But I'm not here to give a report on that. I'm just here for the show. So what sort of prompted our idea for tonight's show was a tweet that Miles did. Again, he needs to put public intellectual in his bio and probably list his CV and his degrees somehow. Get in there too. So let's talk about this. We know that we live in strange times, and the tables have sort of turned on evangelical Christians. We now border on being considered domestic terrorists or some lower life form. And Miles, you had the temerity to take issue with this new commonly held belief that there's nothing much worse than being a conservative Protestant who grew up in the South. So let me get that banner off your face, and we'll let you. I'll just let you read the tweet and tell us why in the world you wrote it.
Yeah, well, so
what I tweeted out was that I grew up in a conservative Protestant household in a small town, a smallish town, in North Carolina, and I have healthy relationships with my parents, whose views on religion I still largely agree with. And then I sort of joked and said, please join me for a podcast that no one will listen to called I'm from the Bible Belt and I'm fine. And all that's true. I'm from, my hometown is Salisbury, North Carolina. When I was growing up, it was about 25,000 people. I grew up in a conservative Presbyterian church that sort of left the main line and floundered around for a while and then joined the PCA. So kind of the typical, I call it the banner of truth Presbyterianism. And, people who were what people might accuse of being adjacent to fundamentalists on things like alcohol and whatnot. We use grape juice for communion. We did communion quarterly. We had just, an old woman banging it out on the piano as our worship, and used a hymnal. And so I think there's this idea that that's the worst possible socio-intellectual fate for someone to have grown up in that milieu. And what you kind of realize is that it's actually fairly healthy. What prompted the tweet was an announcement by Russell Moore, the paragon of cosmopolitanism that he is, was doing a podcast with
Russell Moore, who collects bobbleheads, including of himself. Let's just throw that in there.
Right. So I saw that he was having a conversation with Philip Yancey, I've read some of Philip Yancey's books. I think he has some interesting things to say. But the language of the podcast was that it was this language of surviving the Bible Belt. And there's a couple problems with that. One, if you've ever lived in the South, you know that the Bible Belt people are actually nowhere near the most problematic people. It's the people who don't have any Bibles and inevitably don't have any belts that are pretty scary. And so this notion that Bible Belt Christianity is some sort of sociocultural boogeyman that has wrecked the lives of thousands of people. Maybe the first, 2 billion stories about it, you'd believe. But then after a while, you just realize that this is a shtick. It's a shtick really that has to do with people sort of anathematizing their families in order to do a sort of socio-religious leveling up. So you got
to be looking forward to Thanksgiving so you can correct all your parents' views, and you can demonstrate your moral and intellectual and religious at this point superiority, because you're an Anglican now, which means you're practically landed gentry of some kind.
Well, we're ACNA, not TEC, so we lost our money in our buildings. So it's good for us to be poor, I think, in some ways. But I mean, as much as it's a joke, it's really remarkable that I do go home and can talk about the faith with my parents, and we don't have any significant disagreements. We don't argue about religion, and so I think there's a search for perfection that some people are pursuing that I never had. I also think that some of it's I grew up with relatively well catechized Presbyterians. One of the things that prompted this was I'm reading a lovely little book by David Calhoun called A Sheep Remembers. It's his final book, and Lig Duncan wrote what was a really lovely preface to it. And I thought about there's this sort of real sense of gratitude in that book, and I think what sort of bothers me about the tweets by guys like Moore and Yancey is there's this sort of absence of observation of the fifth commandment in some ways when these conversations start. It's sort of dispositionally okay to talk down your parents or talk down your grandparents or whatever whatever people were involved in your community. And I'm
let's address
still,
let's
yeah,
address something. Some people would say that's always been the case. Children have always been rebellious. They've always condemned their parents or thrown them under the bus or left them for a while and then maybe come back. But that's not really true, is it? I mean,
no, it's not,
that's not
because
been the norm.
no, what's happening here is it's very public. Um, and it's a difference.
Which makes it more unseemly. That makes it more
Yeah.
unseemly. Yes.
It does. Every high schooler has a fight with his dad, right? You complain to your friends like, "Oh, I'm mad at my old man for doing this," and so inevitably, yeah, those are things you kind of have your rebellious moment, then you come back. And what you would probably not do though is get up in front of a bunch of people in a church and say, "My parents are bad Christians because they vote this way, or they think this way about the civil order. They think this way about politics." Um, and so I think there's plenty of stories out there, but I also think it's become a sort of voyeurism. It's become a way of kind of looking in and say, "Oh, well, thank God I'm not like those people." And I'm very thankful for the community I came out of. Would I choose to go back and do it exactly like that? No, I don't think anybody's like that. But what I can't do is say my upbringing was bad. There was something qualitatively wrong. I'm still a Christian because of my upbringing. I'm still a Protestant because of my upbringing. So in that sense, it was very faithful. And I think it deserves, if not veneration, then some sort of public sense of real public respect.
So, is there something uniquely Southern about the criticism? I mean, is this Southerners criticizing Southerners? Is this? I mean, I don't get the sense it's primarily coming from the Northeast or the halls of intellectualism. I mean, Russell Moore, I think he worked for Union University. He's not some highbrow guy. I mean,
Right. Well, I mean, I'll let Ben's also a Southerner. He works. I don't know if people listening know this. Ben and I are in real life friends. We get together in Charlotte and hang out. So we're not just online friends. We're in real life friends as well. So I'll let him talk. But I think one of the things I'm very thankful for is the Southernness of my upbringing, and I've thought a lot about so much of the discussions that go on. About the South, about religion. One of the things I knew, there's a relatively well-known guy in Southern Presbyterian circles when I was growing up. His name was Greg Singer. And guys like that, you just knew. And so you kind of get cooked for better or worse into certain ecosystems. And so you get to know the good, the bad, the ugly of your own denominational community. And what you realize is most of the time, what is good but not perfect. What is bad but not monstrous. And what is ugly, but it's not sort of this terrifying abrogation of Christianity. So I think there's this real sense of just perfection. People are looking for something that I don't think exists, which is a perfectly fulfilling religious upbringing.
well, how much of it is aesthetic and not moral? Do you think?
The word I use a lot with my students is sentimental. It's a search for a sort of sentimentalism, a moral sentimentalism. You want your parents to have never made mistakes. You want them to be what you want to be. And so I found that I think that's as much a part of it as anything. It's kind of sentimentalism. So it's moral in the sense of it kind of claims a moral framework, but whether it's sort of transcendently moral, I think is another question.
Okay, Ben, tell us what you think about all this, because I mean you're sort of wishy-washy and you don't come right out and say what you think, but maybe you'll violate your principles and be really forthright and plain spoken tonight.
As a person who spent a full 36 hours in constant contact this summer with Ben, I was struck by his subtlety and his unwillingness to speak his mind. It was a big surprise for me.
I tell you, one of the things that I see in the midst of a lot of this, my go-to for a lot of stuff is Russian literature, because the Russians just understand human nature better than just about anybody else. And one of the foundational books that speaks exactly this is Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons.
Yes,
and that whole novel is about the problem that we're talking about right now. This generational shift that was happening in 19th century Russia that eventually led to the revolution and the murder of the czars and all of the trouble that came with that. And from that, what I'm seeing going on, to kind of piggyback on something that Miles said earlier about the fifth commandment, is there is a lack of thankfulness for the faithfulness of previous generations. And of course, you see that all throughout the Old Testament. The go-to passage that I think of in a case like this is Rehoboam, when he's given the opportunity to listen to the counsel of his elders and listen to the counsel of his friends, he goes with his friends and divides the kingdom. And there's so much in the book of Proverbs that's focused on this as well, about young people remembering that the world was not created the day they were born, that they are inheritors of a long-standing tradition, and that tradition is a good thing, right? It's a stabilizing thing. It is again, to go back to that word inheritance, is such an important thing, especially, for those of us in the South, the idea that, again, that there's these generational promises that have been laid down, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations back, that we are responsible for holding and carrying on for the next generation. But again, going back to the Russian stuff again, the whole idea again of year zero and the concept that every generation kind of has to remake the world in its own image, is a great idolatrous tendency. And that is becoming the normal mindset of, this present generation. And so you're seeing that kind of flowering in a lot of this conversation about, looking back at your parents and saying, okay, they don't have the education I do, for example, so they must not be as smart as I am. They have not read this book. That means that they are less than. And that's where it kind of gets into the moral stuff, is the moral consciousness that they have drives towards a worldview. And I know our good buddy Daryl hates that word, but a worldview that, again, is trying to remake this new world, totally divorced from anything that came before. And that's inherently unstable, and it's inherently destructive. And that's part of what you're seeing too in our own day and age. As people don't have anything to hold on to, they're just free falling into nihilism. And that's where all this ends up. It ends up in nothingness. It ends up in, in exactly where, German liberalism ended up in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So
what you're saying is it makes perfect sense that Arby's is about to release its own vodka flavors.
Hey, I'm very much looking forward to curly fry infused vodka. That is a lifelong dream of mine, and I will not allow my dreams to be destroyed.
If you have to ride off into oblivion, you might as well have a nice liquid jacket on of curly fry vodka.
Introduced Ben.
We are of
gentleman.
course accepting corporate sponsorship. So Arby's, if you are listening and you would like to send us a case or thrice, we happily will accept them. Please reach out in the DMs. Thank you.
Eat at Arby's.
Eat at Arby's. They have the meat.
So how much of this hubris on the part of young people is simply the result of the fact that they know how to, download an app and set up their parents' iPhone, and their parents don't know how to do those things.
I think you could, if we can get even more petty with it. I think in some ways you're looking, the dumbest thing about the smartphone era is the whole phenomenon. Whether it's just a zeitgeist or just a made up headline or not, but people not wanting to pursue relationships with another person because when they text them, they get a green bubble back on their iPhone instead of a blue one. And I think this moment here is maybe stupider because, sort of like Miles said, you've got people who were, raised in a church, raised amongst prayerful grandmothers, prayerful mothers, prayerful great grandmothers who, every night woke up or before they went to bed, prayed for their family, all the way down to, the troubled, cousin who was clearly going down the wrong path, to the other granddaughter who's, an honor student and very much probably going to get into the school of her dreams. And just, I think it's just this self-created arrogance, looking back on that. And I think you could argue too is as families get further apart, you're not going to as many funerals for these people. And so you don't have this mortality. And I mean, I remember my great-grandmother died a few years back. She was 106 years old.
Wow.
There's actually a person watching live who may actually have met her. We've shared quite a few stories about it. But it was I never went to church. I don't remember going to church with her ever. She went to a small Baptist church in her town, and going back and hearing the stories from her pastor and the other people who were in her town about what a woman of faith she was. I mean, if I hadn't already been a Christian, I would still believe that would have had a dramatic effect on how I viewed the religion of small town, rural, Southern America in this case, not North Carolina, but another firmly south of the line state. And and as some other family members come very much up on the end of mortality, you're kind of faced with it. And I think people who aren't faced with that, they may not have the perspective that they need. This is probably the most serious thing I'll ever say on this podcast, but I don't think you can discount the lack of death in some, and that's going back to Russian literature. That's part of what made it so effective and so impactful is death was always right there in front of you.
And we've learned during COVID that young people don't fear death at all either, right?
Right. I think a lot of this, Resby, your point about death is really important. I think there's just I'm thinking, Ben's got me thinking about the character of Ryazanowski in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. And the hubris, I think, and probably what I think it has a lot to do with is there's a real sense that you can transform the world or make it perfect if you just get the right kind of socio-intellectual or socio-moral formulations in your community. You can do it. And I think bringing up COVID actually is worthwhile, because what's happened is we've kind of now taken that and applied it to disease. If you just do the right things, if you follow the exact right little rules, if you do this, you can keep your family from ever getting disease. And so what's happening is we're creating we're creating a paradigm of neonomianism, whereby if you just follow new rules that are thrown up, and in the case of a lot of evangelicals, they're kind of intellectual and religious rules that end up, by the way, having partisan consequences. So because of this socio-intellectual rule, you have to have some sort of political involvement that looks like X because of it. And so Now it's in something like medicine, and so I think there's a real sense that we've lost a stoic disposition in Christianity. I taught the scholastics and the humanists the last couple of weeks, and it's funny. My students really pick up on this sense of, hey, these guys have a gravity to them. The medievals have a real sense of gravity to them, and some of that is because right up through the Reformation, John Calvin has a deep appreciation for the Stoics. There's a real sense that we're still human, and there's just some things on this side of eternity that aren't going to be fixed. And the type of person that tries to fix them ends up breaking the rules of human association. Aristotle talks a lot about the person who tries to act outside of their community ends up trying to become a god and ultimately becoming beastly. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on. People are sort of saying, okay, I'm so tired of that community for being flawed. I'm so tired of it for being wrong. I'm going to get out of it. And by this attempt to get out of it, you become sort of a moral beast in a lot of ways. And so I think that that's a perfectionism that has really done a disservice, as Ben said, to communities, as Resby said to funerals. I mean, I remember I went to a lot more funerals when I lived in my hometown than I do now. I never go to funerals. I went to them pretty regularly as a child. And so there's so much of this, I think, that this sense of place I'm so thankful for, because that sense of place also kind of allowed me to clue into the fact that it wasn't perfect, and the fact that it wasn't perfect wasn't license for me to anathematize it. And I think that's the big tension. Especially younger Christians today, have a real sense that you're not perfect, you failed, therefore I have the license to throw you off. And every Western intellectual would warn against that disposition right up until the 20th century.
Well, as Christians, let's talk about the fifth commandment issue, because you mentioned that earlier, and it's something we ought to take seriously. In what sense is this a violation, in many cases, of the fifth commandment? But we should also talk about some other things. I mean, are we violating the fifth commandment when we throw, whole traditions under the bus? When we harp on minor or incident, when I say incidental, I mean a few incidents of failure on the part of people like Machen, for instance, or in the PCA, Morton Smith, who's been thrown under various buses for various reasons. But let's talk about the more immediate family context first. How is it a violation of the fifth commandment? Is this not just a phase these kids will grow through, and we should just no big deal?
What I would immediately, and this might be a little too much, but what I think of when I think of the kind of things that we're seeing in regards to the fifth commandment, I think of Ham's uncovering the nakedness of his father. The willingness to not just throw your father or your mother under the bus, but to bring shame upon them. And as much as our culture wants to get rid of shame and tries to act like, that shame is some kind of, prehistoric notion, we all operate under, that kind of rubric in our own minds. And so when you talk about your father who watches Fox News and voted for Trump, in the same breath that you talk about a camp guard at Auschwitz, you do something to them personally. You're not just othering them, but you're claiming that they are subhuman. And a lot of the language that I see on Twitter, especially, rises to that level. And it's just, it's so just, I don't know, bizarre to me as somebody who was raised to not just know that my grandfather did X, Y, or Z, but that that's what sinners do. right? I mean, that's just the way it is. We are we're sinners, and we're going to do sinful things, but you don't make that sin the identity of that human being.
Right.
The old thing about everybody has a drunk uncle. Well, we can talk about that drunk uncle in our family, but if you say one word about him, I'm going to come across his table and I'm going to lacerate your throat. Well, there's a sense of honor in that our culture has lost.
We've
you're suggesting
sacrificed
we
the
just
honor for the slate pitch. Is just
Yes.
I mean, we've slated them, and I think I've mentioned this account on Twitter before. John Ekdahl, I think he works for Decision Desk, but going back to the Auschwitz, he had a tweet the other day. It's getting real tough to not violate Godwin these days, and it is, and I wonder. I'm not necessarily making this analogy, but I could see some similarities. Is the more you do that in terms of make those comparisons, it comes to mind like the ideas of like your brain on some sort of I don't want to say cyber addiction, but let's say porn, for example. Once you get used to that, it gets easier to do it and to justify it going on and on and on. And suddenly you're really not seeing people, you're seeing something else entirely. And the more that we continue to make those kind of comparisons of like, or even equating, things that may be wrong, but still may be smaller sins, equating them with the grandiose. You're making the same exchange there. You're no longer deciding to see someone as a person.
Well, I just want to know what sort of place of privilege Ben comes from that he's only got one drunk uncle. So that's just astounding. Yeah. So
my mom was an only child.
Oh, well, my dad was too. So I've got the same problem. As Southerners, and of course, Resby didn't exactly grow up in the South, but Resby's a man of the world. I mean, he claims, aggrieved ethnic groups across the globe, and he's an honorary Southerner and all this. But
I've got my papers.
That's right. If you grew up in the South, you know that people did bad things in the past. I mean, you grow up with it, and you can't get away from it. And I don't know that means you develop a comfort level with it, but there's a sense of realism. And I think we all learn things about our parents and our grandparents, and some people hear about, terrible things that were done a few generations before. And, how do you deal with that? And I think Miles is suggesting that in previous generations, we dealt with it a little differently than we do now. I mean, you talked about neo-nomianism. There's nothing new about neo-nomianism. There's just a different version of it, and it keeps coming around.
Well, one of the things I think is worth pointing out is we just using, I think, an understandable way we talk about is to say, how do we deal with the past? And I'm a trained historian, so I think about the past a lot. I'm not sure I can ever, quote unquote, actually deal with it. And what I mean by that is I can't fix certain things. It's one of the reasons why I think some of the language about, say, racial reconciliation, however well-intentioned it was, kind of ends up being ridiculous. Like, you can't fix slavery. It was really bad. Like, you think that, 4,200 dudes or however big the SBCs, well, they don't have a General Assembly. What do they call it? I don't know. What do Baptists call their thing?
Convention.
Yeah, whatever. So like however many, bazillion Baptists.
A gaggle of geese.
Yeah. However many bazillion Baptists get together in 2019 and say, we're apologizing for slavery. Like, I kind of wonder what the enslaved, the formerly enslaved saints in heaven are thinking, like, thanks. right? Oh, appreciate it, bro. Like that fixes the fact that I was brutalized by my master. So I think what happens is you end up cheapening historical ills. You actually end up cheapening historical wrongs. Like the notion that you can apologize for historical wrong, I think is somewhat specious. In the same way that you can right it in the here and now. There's this idea that every historical sin needs to have some sort of presentist sense of justice applied to it, that's just not the way history works. You can't fix history. I wrote a thing for First Piece, for a piece for First Things this week, and one of the things I said was, the problem is there's this idea that, well, if we just tear down all the bad stuff in history, then we'll be able to finally fix, humanity. And the problem is you're really mad at humans. You're just mad at humanity, because humanity, as Torvald said, is just messy. Humans are messy. I'm from the South. Like, I come from a family that in the 19th century owned slaves. Like, that's messy. Like, I can't fix that, right? Likewise, I'm not sure what it would mean to fix it.
Right.
So I think we're operating in kind of a post-historical paradigm in so much of this. So we're not really doing history, and we're not really doing church. Like, we're doing really sentimental affirmations of neoliberal, sort of neoliberal therapeutic discourse.
You're an Anglican now, but I assume that you still hold to the doctrine of total depravity. And as Presbyterians, we know that's true, and it explains a great deal. It tells us that, of course, our ancestors were sinful and did bad things, and it tells us that people did bad things to them, and it tells us that in the the interlocking web of sin leads to sin. We don't know what sin preceded the sin of 2 or 3 generations ago, but we know we can't do anything about that. And because of total depravity, our ability to understand and to apply whatever wisdom we think we may have is also highly suspect. We're not good judges of ourselves, so we're probably not that good of judges of others either. But I'd like to hear what Ben has to say about applying the doctrine of total depravity. And we believe sin's bad and you ought to repent of it, and you ought not do it. But we also, that doctrine should generate a certain humility in us.
Well, that's one of the problems of getting away. And I know there's a lot of sophomoric conversation about this today, but it's one of the problems with getting away from a classically founded education is, if you are reading, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations at a young age, if you are, as was, everybody read that for centuries, that kind of Stoic stuff that Miles was talking about earlier. When you have a humility about your own place in the world, you have a much more realistic view of not just human nature, but of what human nature is capable of. Tonight at prayer meeting, we were going through Jeremiah 13, and we've been reading Jeremiah chapter by chapter on Wednesday nights. And in Jeremiah 13, one of the things that Jeremiah is told to do there is he's told to take a linen sash and wrap it around himself and not put it in water. And then he's supposed to take it and bury it in a hole in the ground by the Euphrates River. And one of the points of that whole thing is that he is, through the witness of the Lord, is trying to get the Israelites to understand that their sin is not just, on their own hearts, but that their sin is causing, division between God and them. And as they don't see the seriousness of sin, and as they don't understand the consequences of sin, sin becomes, both at the same time not a big deal, and also only something that other people do. And of course, we see that with the Pharisees. They are real big on, pointing out the sins of everybody else, as we see in Luke 18, thank you, Lord, I'm not like that man over there, and that kind of stuff. And so in the midst of all that, as you lose what sin really is, you start trivializing sin, and you start missing, again, the big point that, for instance, one of the things that gets brought up all the time in this transference talk about, asking forgiveness of generational stuff is Daniel in, Daniel chapter 8 or chapter 9, where he is, asking forgiveness for Israel. Well, he's not in that passage. He's not, claiming for himself that he is the one who sinned, right? He's acting as kind of the voice for Israel and laying out these things so that, as the people are becoming more aware of, the situation that they're in Babylon, that as they own their own place in that they're not, again, kind of laying out the sin of Jehoiakim or the sin of Asa or whoever as their own, because it's not their sin, right? They didn't commit that, so they can't ask forgiveness for it. And so they need, again, to understand that if they want to see the return into the land, they need to kind of look at themselves and understand that they are responsible for their own sin, and they need to understand what that sin really is. And that changes, again, the big picture. Because if you're going around asking forgiveness of the sins of Thornwell, well, you can't do that. You're not Thornwell, and you didn't sin in the way Thornwell did. So how can you, in any real sense, pay the penalty, right, or atone for that sin? And so it just misses the whole understanding, the scriptural understanding of what sin is and how it operates, not just individually, but in the eyes of the Lord. And all that confusion just creates even more confusion all the way up and down the line.
I want to jump in. This point about confusion seems really important to me, and I'm glad Ben's brought it up. One of the things, if you get into any sort of intellectual pursuit nowadays, you find that, especially among conservative intellectuals, Roman Catholics outnumber Protestants quite a bit. And so one of the things I'm always fascinated about is how does someone stay Protestant if they're conservative and they pursue, a PhD in history or politics or whatever it is. And I think we've seen conversion to the Roman Church is pretty common nowadays. One of the things I think, and I've talked to a colleague recently about this, I've always asked myself, why did I never feel the tug to Rome? And it's this deep sort of dispositional fifth commandment observance that is just bred. It's not because I'm a great guy. It's just bred into me. And one of the things I think you honor is the institutions and people that make you a Christian. And you also honor the process a little bit. And so this is an anecdote, but I think it's a really important one. I never felt ashamed to be Presbyterian growing up. I never felt among Catholic friends or among, high powered intellects ashamed of my upbringing. And the reason for that was that I think I had good fathers in my literal father and my literal grandfather, but also in people who were in my church. And this is an anecdote, but it's an important one in my life. Growing up, I knew C. Greg Singer very well. He was a professor at Greenville Seminary and a contemporary of Morton Smith, who you mentioned, Chortles. And as a kid, I knew he was a really educated guy. He was gone to the University of Pennsylvania and was educated at Swarthmore. So he was a mainline, Philadelphian. He had a lot of credentials, and he was a sophisticated man who was also a Protestant. And so I never had this sort of crippling fear that, oh no, Protestants or Presbyterians are just ignorant yahoos, because I had seen in my own father and my own grandfather and men like Dr. Singer, this dispositional gracefulness. The fifth commandment, I think, requires me to honor them publicly and to honor the process by which I was made a Christian as a young man and have stayed and intellectually stayed one now. And that's not merely sort of an appeal to sophistication. It's an appeal to their very real devotion, imperfect devotion, just like anybody's, but their very real devotion in their own lives and to me. When I was 8 years old, my great grandmother was in her home. She was bedridden, and so my grandparents, who were supposed to take me to lunch, had to go take care of my great grandmother. And Dr. Singer, who was our family friend, offered to take me to lunch. And so we went to, and if you're really Southern, you'll know what this is. We went to Quincy's. So if you're from the South, you remember what Quincy's is. And he talked to me just like a very kind old man. And I just remember thinking, this is what a gentleman looks like. And it was not just him, but so many examples in my life, in my small town, in my quote unquote Bible Belt upbringing, that showed me that there's just this honor that is due to these men for their devotion, however imperfect it is. It's what's kept me a Christian. It's what's kept me reliant on the Protestant doctrines of grace. And so it would be unseemly in the extreme for me to, whatever difference I might have with my grandparents or my parents or people in my church growing, it would be unseemly in the extreme for me to speak anything less than honor of them in public.
All right,
And
so you work among a lot of Roman Catholics there at Hillsdale.
Yeah, I do.
I mean, you're at you're at the sort of the Ivy League of conservatism up there, and what holds the Catholics? Is it more tied to the tradition than to family, or do you think the same family dynamic is there?
I think it's very much there. I mean, one of the things is that even Catholics joke about being cradle Catholics and not being good Catholics, but there's a healthy amount of respect, especially among cradle Catholics, for that devout Catholic grandmother, that devout Catholic aunt. And so family there's a real sense of honor that's given in Catholic families. That's not to say I affirm their theology, but I think this disposition is one that's present and it can't be ignored. One of the things that's kind of telling to me is that a Catholic who leaves the faith typically leaves the faith. And so like they just get mad. They say, oh, I'm Catholic, but I don't practice. So there's not even a pretension of continuing any sort of devotion. An evangelical leaves the faith, and they typically go through the season where they're actually saying, no, I'm actually the real faith here. Y'all are wrong. And so it's just a very different dynamic. And so, yeah, I think among my Catholic colleagues, I've been impressed by what seems to be a real, especially my cradle Catholic colleagues. I would specify that, what seems to be a real respect for parents and a real, it's our fifth commandment. I forget which one it is for them. But a real sort of observation of the fifth commandment in a way that's impressive. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you have generational continuity among Catholics that you don't necessarily have all the time among evangelicals.
Well, let's be honest. The problem of mobility and people going far away for education or for jobs. I mean, the irony is, if you educate someone well, they're probably going to have to move away from the place where they grew up to put that knowledge to work and to work and to make a living. there's an undeniable problem with a extremely mobile, transient society. Maybe it's easier for Catholics because there are Catholics everywhere. But if you're a PCA person, or maybe even an Anglican, when you move around, the physical move you make probably entails some sort of spiritual move as well.
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
Let Ben go.
Before you start, let me jump in and say I think this is one of the reasons an incredible diversity of worship styles and liturgy and philosophies of ministry that we see in some denominations like the PCA, or certainly in evangelicalism, rubs me the wrong way, because it's hard enough to go somewhere and find another church like you came from, but to find that church and it's so different in so many ways from what you know. I mean, maybe it's selfish, but I think that's a hard thing.
No, absolutely. And, not to be the literature guy tonight, but one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking about, going away, a lot of Southern literature has a theme of that, where the son of the family goes off to Harvard or Yale and comes back to town smarter than everybody else. And, there's usually a character, usually a grandma or a spinster aunt who kind of helps them understand that, you've got that sheepskin on the wall, but, I have 70 years of life experience that is much wiser than that. And usually the story ends with the young man, coming to grips with his hometown and with the blessings of that generational reality. I was down in Columbia earlier this week, and on the way down and way back up, I was listening to Absalom. And, that's one of the key themes of that book. One of the Sutphin kids goes up there and comes back and has to deal with all kinds of family drama. And you kind of realize the blessing of family drama because, there's something nice about that, something familiar about that. But, to step back a little bit on the Roman Catholic thing, I grew up in a town in West Virginia that was split between Italian Catholics and Irish Catholics. Matter of fact, Madonna was right across the street from Immaculate Conception. And I'll let you figure out which one was Irish and which one was Italian. But one of the things I remember about that was that both the Italians and the Irish had these super deep family bonds that were tied into the rituals of the church. And one of the beauties of that, and it's funny me talking about something beautiful about Roman Catholicism, considering that I hold the original Confessional's understanding of Antichrist. But one of the problems we have in the Presbyterian Church is we have a very poor doctrine of baptism. We have a very weak doctrine of baptism. And one of the ways we see this played out is, how many people in your church, and I'm sure that it's true in my church, when you talk about kids going to community class, we use the language of them joining the church when they graduate from community class. Well, we don't believe that. Right? They join the church as covenant children. And they join the church as covenant children because of the inheritance, right? The passing down of the faith and the understanding of what baptism really is. Right? We're not credo Baptists. Right? We don't believe that you fall, vipers and diapers and all that kind of stuff. Right? We believe our children are covenantally holy. And if we believe that and raise them up in that way, I think it changes a lot of how they understand their own faith as they get older. That they've been born into this cloud of witnesses, that they've been born into something that matters, right? That's real, that's tangible. And, so I was baptized in old PCUS right before it became, PCUSA. And I remember my granddad telling me when I was a little kid that, I'd been baptized in the Old Stone Presbyterian Church, which is the oldest, continual operating church west of the Alleghenies. And I remember him telling me that my, sixth great grandfather had been baptized in that same building, and that it meant something that I was baptized there, that it showed the continuation of the promises that had been made in my whatever great grandfather's baptism. While we don't believe in historic faith, that we pass it down, via, the genes, we do believe in the promises that we see in the Psalms of praying for your great great grandchildren, right? That the assurances of the covenant promise will continue down the line. And that, again, that used to mean something in Presbyterianism. And I think it's something that we need as a group of people to kind of get a better hold on. We're far too influenced by Anabaptism on this point. We look far too much for conversions and for signs of revelation and things like that, rather than trusting in baptism and in the work of the Holy Spirit.
As you say all that, it seems to me that it's obvious that American evangelicalism or revivalism, or maybe the kind of Baptist tradition I grew up in, they have to remake the church every generation.
Absolutely.
Now, we do believe that children have to exercise faith and that they have to own the faith for themselves, but we're pointing them to their baptism, and we're pointing them to the covenant promises, not to how they feel on one, Sunday night or one revival meeting on a Tuesday night. And of course, any church is one generation away, as far as we can tell, from extinction. But it
a
seems
Presbyterian, like, if you can keep it, as Ronald Reagan once quipped. Although I may not remember that quote completely accurately.
But Ben, what you're talking about is something that's it doesn't have to be remade constantly. That the normal course is for those children to grow up and embrace the faith, look to their baptism, and continue. Now, we know that doesn't always happen. We are realistic in that respect. So, Miles, I assume you agree with Ben on this, but I'd like for you to hear a little bit about, we hear some of these intellectuals talk about cultural liturgies and political liturgies, and everything's about liturgy now. But what if the most important liturgy is actually, our church liturgies? And let's talk about the power of liturgy in preserving the church and these things.
Yeah, I think so. Ben's point about baptism is an amazing one. I remember when I was in the PCA, sometimes you would see at baptism the preacher would spend like 7 or 8 minutes bending over backwards, almost to let you know it's like he didn't really believe that baptism did anything. I remember just thinking, I was like, man, why the heck are you doing it? And so I think what it seems to me is that the way that a Calvinist understanding of baptism would go, Anglicanism is kind of unusual in that it's a bit more Lutheran on baptism in some ways than strictly Calvinist. It's kind of like it's a true via media between Geneva and Wittenberg in a lot of ways. But on a very basic level, like at least baptism unites you to the church, right? It unites you to the church. And in the church is where, whether it's Presbyterian or Anglican or Lutheran or whatever, you're getting some sort of liturgy. And that liturgy is ultimately revolving around word and sacrament. And so the reason why we baptize kids is we're putting them under the streams of those ordinary means of grace. And so what it seems to me is that not very many people, whether they're Presbyterian, even a lot of Anglicans nowadays with the influx of Baptists into the ACNA, actually believe that the ordinary means of grace mean anything. And so at the end of the day, the liturgy, whether it's in the prayer book, whether it's a more typically sort of a Spartan liturgy in a Presbyterian church, ordinary means of grace is what this is all about. I mean, I know some Presbyterians are uncomfortable calling them sacraments. Well, ordinary means of grace, fine. Like at some point, those are actually what make you a Christian. And I don't mean that's what saves you, but it's what makes you actively sort of have those habits of faith, and that's what's that's what's passed down. And so, listening to Ben talk about baptism, it just struck me as that's absolutely the case.
Well, I once put it this way, and I'm not sure everyone liked it, and I'm not sure everything, but I said, going through the motions is a hopeful thing if they're the right motions.
Yeah,
and that's just the
absolutely.
ordinary means of grace. That doesn't mean that we should encourage people to just go through the motions, but we should encourage people to come to church, and if they're baptized, they ought to participate.
Well, it's
And if they're-
at the risk of being mistaken for a fitness podcast, and it's easy to see how that could happen. Looking at the four of us right now, it is very much you go to the gym every day, or whatever your scheduled workout is, because that's the motion to get you to where it is ultimately a workout towards hope in some weird, very superficial way. But somehow we now think that, every Sunday we have to immanentize the eschaton in order to get me through the next 6 days to then justify going again. And I don't think that's healthy. It's neonomian. And it's a weight around our shoulders. And, it's very strange. That we can so clearly see that principle applies to everything else, but as soon as we talk about the church or things that actually matter, it's just like, well, I'm just not feeling it anymore.
Well, why would a young person today in most evangelical churches, and maybe a few Reformed churches, why would they take liturgy seriously when it becomes a form of ever-changing marketing to them and for them? And even if they participate in a multi-generational worship service, especially in evangelicalism, it changes every 6 months. It just does. And that's got to have an effect. It's got to create expectations for constant change, but it's probably also a cheapening thing.
Yeah, this is an anecdote. Again, I remember going to church and sitting in the same pew with my great-grandparents. And my grandparents were there, and my parents were there too. And I think this question of liturgy, everybody has a liturgy, right? What I think is kind of strange is that liturgy has become so associated with some social and intellectual dispositions. The fancier the liturgy, the fancier your sort of churchmanship is. You almost get to that point. Now, my church has a relatively high liturgy. We're not a fancy bunch of people, though. It's a college parish in some ways, but it's also filled with a lot of people from small town South Central Michigan. So I think, especially in the Sun Belt, where you have suburbs kind of doing their thing, liturgy has become a way of socio-intellectual signaling, and not necessarily what binds people to word and sacrament, not what binds people to the ordinary means of grace.
Well, one of the things I think good doctrine should do, and the ordinary means of grace over time, as we get the full breadth of the revelation that we find in Scripture, is that we shouldn't be surprised by that many things. We shouldn't be constantly surprised by what the world hands us, and the sin in ourselves and the sin in other people. And that's where reading the Old Testament in particular helps, but realistically reading the New Testament, even as we see all the churches, all the problems in the early churches, and we don't do well to idealize any particular part of Christian history, because none of them were altogether
Well, it always screams of that, like, I mean, I guess it's kind of like the tired trope is, all the people who are suddenly finding Eric Clapton problematic in the last year. It's like, oh man, I idolize this guy, but I don't agree with him on these very big things. Meanwhile, conservatives who listen to music are just like, yeah, well, welcome to the club. And I think a lot of that, going back to the original topic at the beginning of this episode, I think there's part of that we're just, I think, confessional, call it fundamental, whatever you want to do, but something with a scriptural and confessional backing, you are prepared to be not surprised by the fact that people are sinners, right. And you sort of expect it. Is the idea that this person isn't perfect. It's like, okay, well, I'm actually kind of glad about that because
right.
Now I can actually trust them.
So here's a question for Miles and for Ben before we move on to sort of a little wrap up topic. Is some of this have to do with kind of the extended adolescence that people now live in, and sort of an infantilism that they're sort of stuck in, because people all of a sudden discover that the world is bad, and that people are not altogether trustworthy, and that sin happens. This constant surprise with everything I don't think it's always been that way. So is it a cultural thing that's really developed in the 20th century, and we're sort of paying the price for it now?
Well, I mean, I think some of this is the inevitable consequence of going from an agricultural society to an industrial society to now a post-industrial society. There's so little that most people deal with every day that involves what I would call work, that they're not used to failure. If you grow up on a farm, you're surrounded by death all the time. Not just death from natural life, but from death you this past spring, we raised 20 meat chickens, and I got them in the miracle of modern America. Got 20 meat chickens from the United States Postal Service and from Pennsylvania, and raised them up from day-old chicks till they were 9 weeks old. And when the day came, all my kids and I set up tents here in the side yard of the manse, and had killing time. And I was real careful when I was doing that with the kids not to use euphemisms about what was going on.
Like they were going to pass away.
We weren't dispatching them, right? We weren't taking them over the Rainbow Bridge, right? These chickens were dying so that we could eat. And there's an importance about that. There's you remember back when Jay Leno used to do the headline joke things, where he would take these snippets out of local newspapers and do that stuff. Well, there was a famous one where a woman wrote in a op-ed about against hunting, and one of her salient points in her comments is that why can't hunters just go get their meat from the store? As if the meat in the store wasn't a living animal at some point in time. and so there's just a disassociation from reality that we live in today. And of course, you see that most beautifully laid out in my mind in Blade Runner. And you also see it, even more beautifully laid out in Idiocracy. Mike Judge's.
There's only been one accurate movie of the future so far, and at some point we're all going to.
And so, as we move further and further away from reality, you're going to see more and more of the kind of thing you describe and we're talking about today.
I played hobby farmer for a few years. I had a small flock of sheep, and yeah, some of my sheep died because of my stupidity, and because of theirs, of course. And as someone who was trying to to maintain this small farm, I used to say, I find something else I'm not very good at every month or every couple of weeks. There's something else that I've failed at. Um, that's the way it is. I'm happy not to be doing that anymore. But whoever made the point about failure, and and really even just exertion. I mean, you can get out of the habit of exerting yourself. You can very quickly become distance from that, and learn to avoid it. And I've probably been guilty of that a few times too. So yeah, that's we can't fix these problems, but we can sure talk about them. So thank goodness for podcasting. That makes us all stronger and better. So I think Miles has seen this article, and on this theme of being surprised by things that have been obvious to many of our forebears. There was an article in our favorite website, the Gospel Coalition, by our second most favorite Gospel Coalition writer after Brett McCracken, and that would be Trevin Wax. He of the hair product and the brightly colored shirts. But Trevin Wax read a book by George Yancey and a lady with an unpronounceable name that I will not try to pronounce. And it looked at the difference between conservative Christianity, which we've been talking about tonight, and progressive Christianity, which is more or less to say mainline, although we might say, looking at evangelicalism, increasingly it describes evangelicalism. But there were three findings that Trevin gleaned from this book, and he deemed them all very surprising. So let me read them, and as we sort of look to wrap up, we'll talk about whether these things are or should have been surprising.
Prices.
So here's one finding. Progressive Christians are more likely to establish their identity through politics, while conservative Christians find their identity in theology. So, who's shocked by this? I don't hear it. I don't hear anyone. Imagine that. Believing in something, people who believe in something actually believe in things. I think that's the summation of that. So, Miles, what did you make of this? How could this shock anyone?
One of the things I want to know, this is a sidebar, but I think it's an important one. And Ben and I have actually talked about this in person. We sometimes go have a pint at a pub in Charlotte and chat. I would actually propose that centrist or progressive evangelicalism is sociologically actually more liberal than the mainline in some ways. I think the sociology of the average person in the pews of a mainline church is old enough. I know that this word boomer gets overused, but there's not the type of moral earnestness or moral energy you have. We talked about this, I think, was it last Christmas? And a lot of those folks aren't very well catechized, and you can say you can make a lot of complaints about the nature of their devotion, their Christianity. But when it comes to actually framing their interaction with the civil order and socially the order and how their Christianity interacts with that, they're actually quite conservative. I think what you see is that evangelicalism, if anything, is actually more dispositionally progressive than even the old mainline in some ways. And so what I think passes, what I one of the things I used on that tweet, by the way, was I used the term conservative Protestant, not evangelical. So I think what you're kind of seeing is evangelicalism has, in Trevin Wax's piece, evangelicalism has always actually presumed a certain type of progressive, on telos, right? Like there's always this notion that things are going to be better and better and better.
Yeah,
And
well, evangelicalism, I think, is both early stage and late stage Finney. I mean, early
yeah,
stage Finney was a raving revivalist, and when the results of his revivals were unsatisfactory, he became a perfectionist who was a social progressive. And you mix all that up, and you've got a 21st century evangelical, I think.
yeah, and I think what you see is there's a lot of people who are actually not particularly progressive per se, but they've just gotten cooked into this teleology of progressivism that comes from evangelicalism. So they're realizing, oh my gosh, maybe I've actually been a part of a movement that has some fundamental problems, but you can't use that language, right? You can't wake up and be like, I don't know, I think evangelicalism is fake and it was made up in Wheaton in the 50s to sort of retroactively create an intellectual tradition that united Jonathan Edwards and Billy Graham. Right? You can't say that if you're an evangelical. So what you have to say to yourself is, "Oh my gosh, I think evangelicalism is turning liberal." Of course, it was always that way, right? It's just that you finally arrived at the socio-intellectual consequences of that, and you realize they're kind of crazy. So what you can't do is admit that the whole movement was that way to begin with. You have to say you have to create a division like conservative evangelical and progressive evangelical. And the fact of the matter is, it was always kind of slouching one way. And so I think I think what you're seeing is people are kind of getting to the point where they're seeing the consequences of what's really a sociological movement, not a religious one. Evangelicalism is sociological. And so they're getting to the sociological consequences, and they're kind of freaking out because it's bad.
Yeah, you said slouching and not towards Jerusalem. In
Right,
this case.
yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So that's my
No, no, that's a good.
2 minute take on it.
Yeah, and you see
Very helpful.
you see this exact same thing that Miles is pointing out. Martin Lloyd-Jones, in his criticisms of Billy Graham in the 1960s, especially when he was in England doing his shows and things like that, he criticized Graham greatly for appearing on stage with Leslie D. Weatherhead and a bunch of the progressive Anglican men of the day. And Lloyd-Jones' complaint was primarily that Graham was more interested in respectability, in gaining an ear of these men, and that he basically destroyed the confidence of the evangelicals in England at the time, because he was more interested in kind of the social stuff than he was the basic church stuff. Just the ordinary, daily, boring Christianity. And Ian Murray gets into that as well in Evangelicalism Divided, which is a fantastic book, which everybody should read, which really gets at the heart of some of the things that Miles was saying, about the disposition of evangelicalism.
All right, let me read point 2 from Trevin. He's also surprised that research shows, or at least observations of these authors, I don't remember what their methodology was, conservative Christians are more likely than progressive Christians to defy political orthodoxy. So the finding is that far from being politically monolithic or hidebound, they're more likely to go different directions at different times. Does that shock anyone?
No, I think you can see it in the guests we've had on this show. There are a number of conservatives who did not vote for the nominee in the last political election. I think there are a number of conservatives who, for whatever reason, decided not to or decided to. But I know very few on the other side of the spectrum, on the left side, who didn't pull the lever for that nominee. And so I think that and I think there was a very, at least at first, principled never Trumpism. Sorry to use language like that on the show, but it was definitely there in 2015 and 2016, and had a very, with good reason, you could say, an unproven person who up until his nomination was in fact a Democrat. There's pretty good reason to not vote for somebody, or to at least defy political orthodoxy at the time. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I one of the things that I tell people is when I talk about my employer here in Hillsdale, I interact with the most interesting people who have just a wide range of just completely diverse opinions about politics. And so I think what I've realized is conservatives can be this wide range from apolitical to, it just, there's all of this really interesting intellectual debate that goes on here, precisely because most of us are relatively conservative. And I think when you realize that that's a disposition, it's not a partisan, it's not something partisan, it's a disposition. Russell Kirk is magnificent, The Conservative Mind. If you've never read that, it's probably, in my mind, the quintessential intellectual history of conservatism in the 20th century. You realize that conservatives actually are pretty diverse. They don't march to orders. So I think I'm not surprised at all by that, because even my department, you can poll guys and have some really interesting answers, and they're good friends. And so, yeah, I'm not particularly surprised by that. I suppose I'm not sure why people would be surprised, but some of that's just intellectual exposure, I assume.
I'm sure there at Hillsdale, you've got people who buy the little jar of Grey Poupon and some buy the big jar.
That's right.
So I'm sure there's tremendous, diversity there. But
I get my mustard from home. Actually, I have it shipped to me. So.
Oh, okay. Probably
Do
with
they
your
have Dukes in
with your
Hillsdale?
mayonnaise, yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Ooh.
Okay, we won't open it. We're not gonna go to condiment wars. We can't handle that. So the last one, and this is a little more, maybe a little less obvious, but this is another finding from this Yancey book that Trevin was surprised at. Progressive Christians are more likely to seek converts among conservative Christians than among non-Christians. I think this probably points to the whole ex-evangelical thing, really, that former evangelicals trying to de-evangelical their peers. But I think it also brings up the interesting idea that these progressive evangelicals have more respect for fundamentalist Muslims than they do for their conservative Christian counterparts, or the conservative Christians that they used to be a part of. So, do either of you have a thought on this, which I think is less clear than the first two?
Ben, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, in my experience, growing up PCUSA and then attending a PCUSA seminary, those of us who started at PTS who were dispositionally evangelical, I'll call it that, because when I started seminary, I wouldn't say that I was theologically anything, but those of us who were I can't say that word. It's too big of a word this late at night. But who thought we were evangelicals, three things happened to us at seminary. Either we left the faith, or we became progressives, or you became me. I was kind of the outlier. I'm really the only one who actually became.
For the record, I know the full behind the music on this story, and it's stunning that we're here at all.
In class, the progressive professors were always evangelizing the evangelicals, and they were always trying. They're always kind of poking where they know they needed to poke, and by and large, they were successful at that. I mean, one class we never had at PTS was evangelism. That was not an important thing. We had multiple classes on ethics, multiple classes on church history, but the church history classes at Pittsburgh were very much focused on how the church grew out of its out of its fundamentalism. How it discovered true Christianity in the 19th century. And how going forward we could shed the remaining fundamentalism that was within us. So that was a real concern. There was, I ended up at RPTS, and at RPTS we went into the Jewish neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and knocked on doors and gave out Gospels of John and stuff. That was certainly not happening at PTS. We was actually the other way around. We would have rabbis come to PTS and evangelize us to become progressive Jews, which we actually had a couple students become progressive Jews, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. But no, I mean, everything I read in the article there is spot on about what I experienced in seminary and elsewhere.
This third point, it kind of reminds me of that, like, come on, bro, just join us, bro. This time it'll be different, bro. We really mean it, bro. This time we just need you to join us, bro. Like, these tears are real, bro. Like, come on, man, just leave the faith, bro. Like, it's that meme distilled into one coalition article.
I think it kind of goes back to what I feel like is the point about sociology. When the Latter-day Saint missionaries go around the world, they go typically to people kind of on the periphery of society. And evangelicals for a long time were on the periphery of intellectual society. And so who can you proselytize? He's the guy who really wants to be in the in group, right? He's been, C.S. Lewis's Inner Ring essay comes to mind. They really want to be in, and this is a way for them to do it, right? I can finally I don't have to be weird anymore. I don't have to be a fogey anymore. Name it, right? And I think so. You see this appeal happen a lot, right? You can finally be cool. It's one of the reasons I think why evangelicals oftentimes the disposition to go to Rome is very much similar to the one to go to progressive evangelicalism. Trying to finally exorcise the demons of your mean conservative Protestant upbringing. And I think it's hard necessarily to fix that, but I think very much to me it just points to the fact that what is called quote unquote evangelicalism is sociology. And I'm more and more convinced of that every day.
All right. Well, we could do any number of shows on this, but I trust this has been helpful. Anything anyone wants to throw in before we sort of wrap up? I'm working on a shoestring tonight, so the production's going to be a little more onerous. So I don't want to go too long because I do have to get up early in the morning. But I think we've introduced some helpful topics. And if anyone wants to read this article on the Gospel Coalition, it's 3 surprises from new research on progressive and conservative Christians. So I'll put this in the show notes, but Ben is an ARP pastor. Miles is a professor of some sort. I know there's all these adjectives and qualifiers at Hillsdale, the Mecca of the highbrow conservative. That's not so. Miles wears cowboy boots, so he's not that highbrow. But
premium mediocre.
So, anything either one of you want to say in parting?
Just thanks for having me on, guys.
Well, it's always a pleasure.
I am curious, Chortles, you staying in the same high-class establishment that Resby and I shared in the great city of Raleigh?
Well, this is a Marriott, and it's pretty.
Man,
It's almost new.
good
So it's
grief!
the bathroom is so new. It hasn't had time to get grimy, and all the tile is clean. It's you feel almost okay going barefoot in the hotel room, and that's not always the case. When you're a cheapskate like me, you've stayed in some hotels that are embarrassing.
It's like Ben was talking about earlier. Some of these highbrow elites like Chortles, they don't really know what it is to work. They just stay in the Marriotts on their work trips, whereas a couple of salt of the earth gents like me and Ben, we go to the Red Roof Inn Plus, which was noticeably minus the free breakfast when we were there. It's hard being oppressed. And especially going back to the podcast, mine, at the end of the day, is as the hardest working part-time, full-time podcast. It's month to month, man.
To quote the great Briscoe Darling from the Andy Griffith Show, all I need is a bed and a Bible. I don't know if you guys remember that episode, but I'll just leave it there. So, Resby,
did I totally missed the quote. You froze up on me right as you said it.
Oh, I said the great Briscoe Darling said all he needed was a bed and a Bible. So that's us.
Yeah,
no doubt.
Do they still put those in the Marriott?
I haven't found one.
Well, Marriott will have Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked too hard. It's been busy. All right. Well, Resby, tell everyone good night. And even though our live viewers can't hear it, I'll find some music to tack on here.
Well, not to give everyone the dusty finish of a podcast, but we're all going to go, and ultimately podcast endings feel unsatisfactory, much like dusty finishes. So if you want something that feels good, you should go watch Starrcade 83. Just go ahead and fire up the main event from Starrcade 83, a little Ric Flair versus Harley race. Spend some time on YouTube looking up the backstory, the wonderful promo where Harley Race puts out a bounty for the head of Ric Flair. And if you want to talk, about the pageantry of a monarch entering a room full of his people, go watch Ric Flair enter Starrcade 83 in the Greensboro Coliseum. So thank you to Miles and Ben for coming on. Again, if you're listening to this audio only, you'll certainly be blessed with our bumper music. But as it is live, as the great, well, not a great person once said, speaking of people who were found out to be a little bit messier than they were, we did it live. So this is Presbycast, reminding you politely that we are accepting sponsorships for Arby's Curly Fry Vodka, and please don't be an Erdman.